Helen Price stood on the bridge of her ship and looked at the stars ahead. She was the commander of a small exploration vessel called the Meridian. For 3 months, her crew had been mapping unknown space far from Earth. Today felt different. Today they found something that would change everything. The young officer at the sensor station suddenly called out. His name was Jake Morrison, and his voice shook with excitement. He said they were detecting an energy reading unlike anything in their database. The pattern pulsed like a heartbeat, strong and steady. Helen walked over to look at his screen. The numbers made no sense. Whatever was out there was massive and powerful. Before she could ask questions, the main screen turned on by itself. An alien appeared before them. The being looked almost human in shape, but its body seemed made of living crystal. Light moved inside it like water. When it spoke, the words formed directly inside their minds. No sound came from the screen. The voice just appeared in their thoughts. The being said it was part of something called the Collective. It said they had watched humanity for some time. Humans traveled alone, separated from each other, suffering in isolation. The Collective offered something better. They offered unity. If humans joined them, they would never feel alone again. Helen kept her voice calm even though her heart was racing. She introduced herself and asked what this unity meant. The alien explained that it meant merging consciousness. All thoughts would be shared. All knowledge would belong to everyone. All pain would disappear. They had brought 17 other species into this harmony already. Humans would be the 18th. Sarah Brooks, the tactical officer, leaned close to Helen and whispered. She said this could be a trap. They had no idea what this process involved or what it would do to a human mind. Helen nodded, but she was thinking about the bigger picture. This could be the greatest moment in human history. First contact with an advanced civilization offering peace and connection. Helen made her decision. She told the alien she would do it. She would undergo their procedure, but only her, and only if her crew could monitor everything that happened. The crystalline being seemed pleased. It said her sacrifice would bring humanity into the light. A few hours later, Helen sat in a strange chamber aboard the alien vessel. The walls were made of the same crystal material as the beings themselves. Thin filaments extended from the walls and floated near her head. Her crew watched through windows, medical scanners ready to track her vital signs. Morrison spoke through the communication system. He told her that her vitals were stable, but they were reading unusual brain activity. He asked if she was sure about this. Helen took a deep breath. She said humanity did not get this far by playing it safe. She told them to begin the procedure. The filaments touched her skin. The world exploded into light. Helen found herself in a vast network of consciousness. Thousands of minds surrounded her, all connected, all working together as one being. The core intelligence of the Collective spoke directly to her. It told her she would now be absorbed. Her individuality would dissolve. Her knowledge would be shared. Her resistance would fade. This was how it always happened. Helen felt pressure against her mind. Countless consciousnesses pressed against her sense of self, trying to dissolve who she was. But instead of giving in, she felt something else rising inside her. Memories flooded through her. Emotions she had felt throughout her life. The chaotic, brilliant, terrifying depth of being human. She told the Collective it had made an assumption. It assumed she came to be absorbed. It assumed humans were like the other species they had conquered. That was their mistake. She opened her mind fully, not to surrender but to show them what they had invited in. The Collective recoiled in horror. They saw everything. Millions of years of human evolution. Predator instincts, warfare, survival against impossible odds, the ability to imagine nightmares and then create them in reality. Art born from suffering, science forged through disaster. The human capacity for unlimited compassion and calculated cruelty existing side by side. More than that, they saw human creativity. The chaotic and unpredictable nature of individual thought. Every human carried within them the potential for madness, genius, love, and destruction, all mixed together in ways that made no logical sense. The Collective had built its existence on order and control. They had eliminated chaos from their society. They had absorbed species that were peaceful, logical, and harmonious. They had never encountered a species that thrived in chaos, a species that loved their contradictions, a species that turned their darkness into strength. The Collective screamed into Helen's mind. They asked what she was. Helen smiled in the darkness of shared consciousness. She told them humans were exactly what they appeared to be, and the collective had just made a terrible mistake. The connection shattered. Helen gasped as she was thrown back into her own body. Alarms blared throughout the alien vessel. Through the observation windows, her crew watched as cracks appeared in the crystalline walls. Dark fissures spread like infection through the perfect structure. The being that had first contacted them appeared in the chamber. Its form flickered and looked unstable. It demanded to know what Helen had done. Her mind was spreading through their network. It was corrupting everything. It was fracturing their unity. She had to stop it. Helen stood up. Her legs felt shaky, but her voice was firm. She told them she was not doing anything. They tried to absorb her. Now they were learning what it meant to have human thoughts in their perfect network. Brooks shouted through the comm system. She ordered someone to get Helen out of there immediately. Helen was already moving. She ran toward the exit as the crystalline structure around her began to pulse with wild energy. Behind her, she could hear the collective's voices rising in a sound unlike anything they had made before. Instead of harmony, there was discord. Instead of unity, there was confusion. They were screaming. Helen collapsed onto the deck of the Meridian as her crew sealed the door. Morrison caught her before she hit the floor. His face was pale. He asked what happened in there. Helen looked back at the alien vessel through the windows. It was pulsing with unstable energy, its perfect crystalline structure cracking apart. She told him she had shown them humanity, all of humanity, everything that made humans what they were. Morrison asked what the result was. Helen explained that the collective could not handle it. They built their entire civilization on unity and sameness. They had never experienced real chaos, real creativity, real fear. Now it was loose in their network. Brooks pulled up sensor readings on her console. She told Helen that the collective's network was becoming unstable. The effect was spreading across their entire star system. Helen felt a cold weight in her stomach. She ordered the crew to leave immediately at maximum speed. As the Meridian moved away at top speed, the crew watched the collective's world begin to change. The orderly structures flickered and dimmed. The harmonious energy readings grew chaotic and unpredictable. Through their communication systems, even as they fled, they could still hear it. Screaming. Thousands of voices suddenly aware of their individuality. Suddenly conscious of the darkness that lurked in every sentient mind. Suddenly experiencing fear and confusion and separation for the first time in their existence. Helen had not conquered the collective. She had not destroyed them with weapons or violence. She had infected them with something far more terrifying than any weapon humanity possessed. She had infected them with humanity itself. 3 days had passed since the Meridian escaped from the collective's star system. Helen could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt them. Thousands of voices, suddenly aware of themselves, suddenly alone, suddenly terrified of what they had become. Brooks entered Helen's quarters without knocking. Concern filled her face. She told Helen there was something she needed to see right away. Helen followed her to the bridge where Morrison had long-range sensor data displayed on the main screens. The collective's star system filled the display, but something was very wrong. The orderly grid of energy signals they first detected had turned into complete chaos. Morrison spoke quietly. He said the fracturing was spreading. It started at the central hub where Helen had connected, but now they were detecting similar problems in 14 other collective locations. Systems they did not even know existed. Helen leaned against the console. Her stomach felt sick. She asked how this was possible. She only connected with their local network. Brooks explained that the entire collective civilization was linked together. One vast consciousness that spanned multiple star systems. When Helen introduced human thought patterns into their network, it spread like a virus. But it was not just spreading. It was changing and evolving. The displays changed to show messages they had intercepted. The collective's once harmonious transmissions had become fractured and discordant. Individual voices emerged from what used to be a unified chorus. Each voice expressed something that had never existed in their society before. Fear, anger, confusion, wonder. Helen whispered that they were becoming individuals. They were experiencing selfhood for the first time in their existence. Morrison pulled up another data stream. He said things were getting worse. They were detecting energy spikes that matched patterns of conflict, fighting. The collective was at war with itself. Helen closed her eyes, but that only made things worse. She could still feel the edges of the connection. The mental residue from her time in the collective's network remained. Through that faint link, she sensed the chaos spreading across their civilization. Beings that had existed in perfect harmony for thousands of years were suddenly discovering loneliness. Purpose that had always been clear and absolute now seemed random and meaningless. The comfort of unified consciousness had been replaced by the terrifying freedom of individual thought. Worst of all, they were discovering human emotions without any understanding of how to process them. Rage without knowing why. Love without a framework to comprehend it. The capacity for both creation and destruction, mixed together in ways their orderly minds could not handle. Brooks said they needed to report this to Earth. Command needed to know what happened. Helen's voice came out sharper than she intended. She asked what they would say. That they accidentally destroyed an entire civilization? That human consciousness was so toxic it acted as a weapon against other species? Morrison turned from his station. He said with respect that they did not know this would happen. The collective tried to absorb Helen. This was the consequence of their arrogance, not humanity's fault. Helen moved to the main screen and stared at the distant stars where the collective's worlds burned with internal conflict. She asked if it really was their fault. Or did the collective simply not understand what they were dealing with? 17 species had joined them peacefully. Humans were the ones who broke them. Humans were the anomaly in the galaxy. A new alarm interrupted their conversation. Brooks pulled up the sensor data. Her face went pale. She told Helen they were receiving a transmission from the collective's central hub, or what remained of it. Helen prepared herself mentally and told them to put it on screen. The being that appeared was barely recognizable. It had been the crystalline entity they first met, but now its form flickered constantly. It looked unstable and broken. Its voice came through as multiple overlapping sounds, each expressing different emotions at the same time. The being addressed Helen by name. It said they were dissolving. The unity was broken beyond repair. They felt everything now. Pain, fear, hope, despair. They did not want these feelings, but they could not stop experiencing them. Helen felt tears in her eyes. She said she was sorry. She did not know this would happen. The being repeated the word sorry. It said that was another human concept. Guilt, regret. Its form flickered more violently. They had tried to isolate the infected parts of their network. They tried to cut off the corrupted connections. But human thoughts adapted and spread. They taught the collective to question everything, to doubt, to wonder if their unity had ever been real or just comfortable slavery. Helen asked what they wanted from humanity. The being's form became steady for a moment. Helen saw something in its structure that might have been a smile or a grimace. She could not tell which. The being said they needed help. Helen had infected them with chaos. Now they needed her to teach them how to survive it. They needed to learn how to be individuals without destroying themselves. They needed to learn how to be human without losing what they had been. Morrison stood up. He told Helen they could not help. They did not have the resources, the training, or the knowledge to help an entire alien civilization through an identity crisis. Helen agreed with him. But she said Earth did have those resources, or at least they could try to provide them. She turned back to the alien on the screen. She told them she would return to their system. She would establish contact with her people on Earth and create a diplomatic channel. But she could not promise anything would work. Learning to be an individual was the hardest thing any consciousness could do. Humans had been doing it for millions of years, and they still barely understood themselves. The being said they would learn together then, or they would destroy themselves trying. Either way, the old collective was dead. Helen had killed it. Now they had to discover what would come next. The transmission ended. Helen stood in the silence of the bridge, feeling the enormous weight of what she had done. Brooks moved to stand beside her. She asked if Helen really thought they could help the collective. Helen thought about Earth with all its chaos and brilliance and darkness. She thought about humanity's long and bloody history of learning to be individuals while still forming communities and nations. She thought about art and war, love and hate, cooperation and competition. She spoke slowly. She said if any species in the galaxy knew how to survive chaos, it was humanity. For better or for worse, Humans understood what it meant to be individual and still work together. Morrison set a course back toward the collective system. As the Meridian turned around, Helen watched the stars and wondered what humanity would think when they learned what she had done. Would they see her as a hero who saved humanity from being absorbed? Or would they see her as a monster who weaponized the human mind against another species? Perhaps she thought she was both. A hero and a monster at the same time. That contradiction was the most human thing of all. The collective's central hub looked completely different from what it had been just 1 week ago. The beautiful crystalline structures that once pulsed with harmonious energy now stood broken and damaged. Jagged fragments pointed in odd directions. Some sections were dark and dead while others flickered with unstable light. Helen stood at the airlock of the Meridian in her protective suit. Brooks checked her equipment one final time. She told Helen that she did not have to go down there alone. Helen shook her head. She said she caused this situation and needed to face it directly. Besides, the aliens specifically asked for her. Bringing others might make them nervous. Morrison's voice came through the communication system. He said the landing zone was clear, but they were reading multiple energy signals moving toward Helen's position. Some of them were moving in strange and unpredictable patterns. He told her to be careful. The small shuttle touched down in what used to be a plaza. Helen could see the remains of the collective's architecture. It had been beautiful in its geometric perfection. Now it looked like a war zone. As she stepped out, figures emerged from the damaged structures. Helen recognized the crystalline forms, but they moved differently now. The collective used to move with perfect unity and purpose. These beings stumbled and hesitated. They looked around as if seeing their world for the first time. In a way, they were seeing it for the first time as individuals. One alien approached her. Its form became more stable as it got closer. Helen felt a shock of recognition. This was the same being that had first contacted them. It spoke through her translation device instead of directly into her mind. It said it was now called Luminar. Names were another human concept they had adopted. They needed names now to tell themselves apart from each other. Helen repeated the name and asked what had happened to their civilization. Luminar gestured to the ruined plaza around them. It said there had been war. Not the kind humans understood with weapons and physical violence. They had something worse. They had ideological conflict and philosophical combat. 3 different factions had emerged from the chaos. Luminar led Helen through the damaged structures. Other beings watched from the shadows. Some looked curious. Others looked hostile and angry. Luminar explained that the first faction called themselves Preservers. They wanted to rebuild the old unity. They saw individuality as corruption and disease. They believed if they could reverse the fracturing, they could return to harmony. Helen asked if that was possible. Could they go back to what they were? Luminar's form flickered with what might have been sadness. It said no. Once a consciousness experienced selfhood, it could not forget that experience. The Preservers refused to accept this truth. They were becoming violent in their desperation to restore what was lost. They reached a gathering space where dozens of alien beings had assembled. Their forms all looked different now. Each one was developing unique patterns in their crystalline structure. Helen realized this was individual expression. They were changing even as she watched them. Luminar continued explaining. The second faction called themselves Embracers. They welcomed the change and saw individuality as liberation from slavery. They experimented with emotions and conflict and all the human experiences Helen had introduced. But they had no framework for understanding these things. They experienced rage without understanding consequences. They felt love without understanding loss. They were like children playing with fire. Helen asked about the third faction. Luminar stopped walking. Its form dimmed noticeably. It said the third group called themselves the Freed. They were not originally part of the collective. They were the 17 species the collective had absorbed over many thousands of years. Helen's chaos had broken the bonds that held them captive. They were awakening and remembering who they had been before being made part of the unity. They were angry, and their anger was justified. Helen felt ice run through her veins. She asked for clarification. Was Luminar saying that she had not just fractured the collective, but also freed 17 enslaved civilizations? Luminar said the vocabulary depended on perspective. The collective believed they were offering unity, peace, and perfection. The absorbed species believed they were being erased. Perhaps humans had a phrase for this situation. Helen murmured that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Luminar's form brightened with understanding. Yes, that phrase described the collective perfectly. They had destroyed entire cultures in the name of harmony. Now those cultures were returning to awareness, and they wanted justice for what had been done to them. A disturbance erupted across the plaza. Helen turned to see a group of beings that looked different from the crystalline collective. Their forms were more biological and organic. Their skin shimmered like oil on water. Luminar spoke quietly. These were the Varesh. They were the third species the collective had absorbed. They had been part of the unity for 8,000 years. Now they remembered what they had lost. One of the Varesh approached Helen. When it spoke, its voice carried deep layers of emotion that made Helen's chest feel tight. She heard grief, rage, and profound loss in every word. The Varesh asked if Helen was the human who broke the collective. Helen stood straight and answered yes. The Varesh said Helen was their liberator and their curse at the same time. They were free now, but they had lost 8,000 years of existence. Their culture, their history, their loved ones had all dissolved in the unity. They remembered now that they once had families, but they could not remember any names. They had created art, but they could not recall its forms. They had sung songs, but all the melodies were gone forever. Helen felt tears threatening to fall. She said she was sorry and that she did not know this would happen. The Varesh leaned closer. It said sorry was another human word, but words did not return what had been taken. Still, they thanked Helen for breaking their chains. Even if freedom brought pain, it was better than slavery. More beings gathered around them. They represented different absorbed species. Each one had a similar story to tell. Cultures lost and forgotten. Identities erased from existence. Memories fragmented beyond repair. Through Helen's accidental act, they were being reborn into a universe that had moved forward without them for thousands of years. Luminar addressed the crowd. It said this was why they had called Helen back. Not for punishment or blame. She represented something they needed to understand. Her species survived chaos and even thrived in it. They needed to learn how to do that, or they would destroy themselves in this newfound freedom. A preserver stepped forward. Its form was rigid with anger. It said they should absorb Helen again. They should force her consciousness back into unity and make her pay for breaking their perfection. Helen felt her hand move instinctively to her weapon, but Luminar raised a crystalline limb to stop the confrontation. Luminar said that was the old way of thinking. That thinking had brought them to this point. They could not force unity anymore. They had to learn something much harder. They had to learn coexistence, tolerance, and acceptance that others could think differently. The preserver's form flickered with rage, but it stepped back without attacking. Helen took a breath and spoke. She said she did not know if she could actually help them. Humanity was still learning these same lessons. Humans were violent, chaotic, and full of contradictions. They went to war over ideas and destroyed each other over differences. They were probably the worst species in the galaxy to ask for advice about peaceful coexistence. An embracer laughed. The sound was like chiming crystals. It said humans survived despite all that chaos. They created beauty. They loved despite knowing they would lose everything. They hoped despite knowing they would suffer. The embracer asked Helen to teach them that, to teach them how to be broken and beautiful at the same time. Helen looked around at the gathered beings, at the shattered civilization, at the impossible task before her. She said, all right, but first they needed to stop calling this a disaster. They were not broken. They were becoming something new, and becoming was always messy and painful. Luminar's form brightened with what Helen now recognized as joy. It repeated the word becoming. Yes, they liked that word. It meant process, change, and hope for the future. 3 months had passed since the fracturing began. The council chamber had been built through a joint effort between humans and the former collective species. It combined crystalline architecture with more organic designs. The building was a physical representation of the merging that was happening across the entire star system. Helen sat between Luminar and Dr. Patricia Logan, who was the chief psychologist Earth had sent to help. Around them sat representatives from each faction and from each of the freed species. These daily negotiation sessions had become routine but were never easy. Helen spoke firmly. She said the violence had to stop. 3 preservers had attacked an embracer settlement the previous night. 5 beings were fragmented, which was what they now called death. The preserver representative called harmonic pulsed with defensive energy. It said the embracers were trying to corrupt more of their people. They were teaching young consciousnesses to reject unity. They had to be stopped. An embracer named Chaos leaned forward angrily. It said the preservers meant the embracers were educating the young, showing them there were choices beyond living in a perfect prison. Luminar interrupted both of them. Its voice carried authority that made both factions pause. It said this was exactly what they needed to overcome. The assumption that there was only one correct way to exist. Dr. Logan spoke up. She said that in human psychology, there was a term for what they were experiencing. Cognitive dissonance meant the discomfort of holding two opposite beliefs at the same time. They were all trying to figure out who they were while also dealing with the trauma of losing who they had been. A Varesh representative named Shimmer spoke with a voice that still carried ancient grief. It said humans had always been individuals from birth. They did not understand what it was like to remember being part of something greater, and then feel that connection cut away forever. Helen thought about her own brief connection to the collective's network. That moment of unity she had experienced before everything fell apart. She admitted Shimmer was right. Humans did not fully understand. But humans did understand loss. Every human experienced it at some point. The death of people they loved, the end of relationships, the passing of youth and innocence. Humans knew what it meant to lose connection. Harmonic asked with genuine curiosity how humans survived loss. Helen admitted they survived it badly. Humans grieved and raged. They made art about their pain. They found new connections to replace old ones. They learned to carry the loss with them while still moving forward with their lives. The chamber fell silent for a long moment. Then Luminar's form brightened. It said there was something they had not told the humans yet. Some of them were developing something entirely new. Not unity as it used to be. Not pure individuality either. A synthesis of both. Helen leaned forward with interest and told them to explain. Luminar gestured toward the entrance. 3 beings entered the chamber. Their forms flickered between crystalline and organic states. They moved in perfect synchronization but not uniformly. They looked like dancers following the same rhythm but expressing it in their own unique ways. One of them spoke. Helen realized their voices harmonized together while remaining distinct. They said they were called the Bridged. They maintained individual consciousness but could voluntarily share thoughts when needed. They experienced selfhood and connection at the same time. Dr. Logan stood up. Her scientific curiosity overrode proper protocol. She said that should be impossible. The human brain could not maintain that kind of dual state. The Bridged replied that they were not human. They were learning to be what Helen had made them. Individual and collective simultaneously. Chaotic and ordered. They contained multitudes, as one of Earth's poets had written. Harmonic's form flickered with both hope and fear. It asked if the Bridged could teach this to everyone. Could they all become bridged? The answer was no. This was not a solution that could be imposed on others. It was a choice each consciousness had to make for themselves. Some would remain purely individual. Some would try to rebuild pure unity. The Bridged were a third option. Not better than the others, just different. Chaos radiated excitement. It said they did not need to choose just one path forward. They could have multiple societies with multiple ways of being. Helen agreed. She said to look at Earth as an example. Earth had thousands of different cultures, each with different values and different ways of organizing their societies. They fought constantly and disagreed about everything. But that diversity made humanity stronger. It allowed for adaptation, innovation, and resilience. Shimmer spoke slowly and carefully. It pointed out that humans were one species with different cultures. The situation here was different. They were many different species, suddenly aware of themselves after thousands of years of forced unity. How could they prevent this from becoming complete chaos? Dr. Logan answered bluntly. She said they did not prevent chaos. Some chaos was necessary for growth. They needed to establish frameworks for conflict resolution, for negotiation, for peaceful coexistence. But they had to accept that disagreement was not disaster. It was just part of existence. Harmonic's form dimmed with sadness. It said they were being told to abandon the dream of unity entirely. Luminar corrected this interpretation. They were not abandoning unity. They were redefining what unity meant. Not as sameness, but as cooperation despite differences. The Bridged showed one possibility, but there would be many others. Helen stood and walked to the center of the chamber. She said she wanted to tell them about Earth's history. Humans nearly destroyed themselves many times. Nuclear war almost happened. Climate collapse nearly killed them. Disease and hatred brought them to the edge of extinction repeatedly. They came so close that the memory still terrified humanity, but they survived. Did they know why? The gathered beings waited in silence for her answer. Helen explained that when things became bad enough, humans remembered that disagreement did not require destruction. They learned slowly and painfully that they could be different from each other and still cooperate toward common goals. It took thousands of years. Humans were still learning. But they were still here and still trying. She looked at each representative in turn. She told them they were going through in months what took humanity many thousands of years to learn. It would be messy. There would be more violence, more mistakes, more pain. But they could survive this. They could build something new. Not the old unity they remembered, but something richer that honored both connection and individuality. The bridged moved closer to Helen. They asked if she would help them. Would humans stay and guide them through this process of becoming? Helen felt the weight of the question. She thought about her crew, about Earth, about the responsibilities and dangers of interfering too much in another civilization's development. She answered carefully. She said they would help, but not as guides or teachers. They would help as partners and equals. Humans were still learning these lessons themselves. Maybe they could figure everything out together. Luminar's form brightened with joy. It said they would create a new council. Preservers, embracers, bridged, freed species, and humans would all have equal representation. They would disagree constantly. They would argue. They would struggle with every decision. Chaos added that they would do it together. Shimmer said they would do it as individuals. Harmonic finished reluctantly that they would do it as a community. The council meeting ended. Each representative returned to their factions with new information to share, new ideas to debate, and new possibilities to consider for their future. Dr. Logan pulled Helen aside after the others left.
She asked quietly if Helen really believed this would work.
Helen watched the diverse beings depart through the exits. Each one was unique. Each one was struggling to find their place in a fractured universe. Helen said she thought working might not be the right way to measure success. This was not about achieving perfection. It was about learning to exist in imperfection. And if there was one thing humans excelled at, it was exactly that. 1 year had passed since the fracturing began. The former collective had reorganized itself into a confederation of independent societies. Each group had found its own way forward. The preservers established small, isolated communities where they practiced voluntary unity. The embracers created dynamic settlements that celebrated chaos and creativity. The bridged formed the largest faction and served as mediators between different groups. The freed species were rebuilding their ancient cultures with help from human historians and cultural experts. Everything seemed to be stabilizing. Then the warning came at dawn during the planet's rotational cycle. Helen woke suddenly in her quarters aboard the Meridian. The ship had remained in orbit for the entire year. Morrison's panicked voice came through the communication system. He said they had incoming vessels. Multiple large ships. The energy signatures matched the old collective's patterns, but these ships were not from this star system. They were demanding to speak with whoever had destroyed the Unity. Helen reached the bridge within minutes while still pulling on her uniform. The main screen showed 3 enormous structures. Each one was much larger than the Meridian. They pulsed with the same harmonious energy the original collective had displayed. This was another unified consciousness, another collective entity from somewhere else in the galaxy. Helen ordered her crew to open a communication channel. The being that appeared on screen made the original collective look primitive and simple by comparison. Its form shifted through multiple dimensions. It looked crystalline and organic and something beyond both descriptions. When it spoke, its voice made the ship's entire structure vibrate. The being said it was called the Unity. They had felt the dissolution of their cousin consciousness across the void of space. They came to investigate what happened. What they found was an abomination. Individuality was a disease. Helen had infected a perfect society. This could not be allowed to stand. Helen forced herself to look directly at the entity. She said the collective had tried to absorb her against her will. What happened next was their own doing, not hers. The Unity said she was lying. They had reviewed all the data from the incident. Helen had deliberately infected the collective with chaos. She was a plague carrier. She would be quarantined. This entire star system would be cleansed. Unity would be restored by force. Alarms blared across the meridian as weapon systems powered up on the Unity vessels. Helen's hand moved toward the communication panel to order evacuation. But another voice interrupted before she could speak. Luminar materialized on the bridge using the transportation technology the bridge had developed over the past year. Luminar told the Unity to wait. It said the Unity spoke of perfection, but did they know what the former collective had discovered through their fracturing? The Unity focused on Luminar with intense scrutiny. It said Luminar was corrupted and fragmented. Luminar could not speak for what the collective used to be. Luminar agreed it could not speak for the past, but it could speak for what they were becoming. And it could tell the Unity that their perfection was built on lies. More forms began materializing on the bridge. Chaos appeared, then shimmer, then harmonic. Representatives from every faction stood together. Even preservers who had spent the year mourning their lost unity now stood beside embracers who celebrated their newfound freedom. Harmonic spoke. Its voice no longer carried rigid certainty, but had been softened by a year of experience. It said they used to be like the Unity. They believed unity meant perfection, but perfection was just another word for stagnation. They never created anything truly new. They never grew or evolved. They simply absorbed other species and made them all the same. Shimmer stepped forward and addressed the Unity directly. It asked how many species the Unity held within its consciousness. Did those species want to be there? Did they choose unity freely, or did the Unity impose it on them the same way the collective had done? The Unity's form flickered with instability for a moment. It said choice was irrelevant. Unity was superior to individuality. Individuality only led to conflict and suffering. Chaos laughed at this. Its form danced with energy. It agreed that individuality led to conflict and suffering, but it also led to art, innovation, love, and growth. They had suffered greatly this past year. They had fought and doubted themselves constantly, but they had also created things they never could have imagined when they were unified. One of the bridged materialized next to Helen. It said they had discovered something the Unity had not. Unity and individuality were not opposites. They were points on a spectrum of existence. The bridged could be themselves while still connecting with others. They could disagree while still cooperating. The Unity offered only one way to exist. The former collective now offered infinite possibilities. Helen watched the Unity entity carefully. Its form had stopped its constant shifting and become more rigid. It was taking a defensive posture. Helen spoke softly but clearly. She said the Unity was afraid. They were afraid that what happened here could happen to them. If they allowed even a moment of doubt, their entire civilization might fracture as the collective had done. The Unity responded that fear was an individual emotion. Unity did not experience fear. Helen said then they were lying to themselves. Unity feared individuality more than anything else in existence. Because individuality meant uncertainty, it meant the possibility of being wrong. It meant questioning the very foundation of their civilization. Luminar moved to stand beside Helen. It said they were not asking the Unity to fracture as they had done. They asked only that the Unity consider that their way was not the only valid way to exist. The species within the Unity might deserve to have a choice about their existence. The Unity asked what would happen if those species chose to leave. Shimmer answered firmly. Then the Unity should let them go. Just as the collective should have let them choose. No consciousness should ever force another into unity against their will. The Unity entity pulsed with unstable energy. Helen could sense internal conflict within it. This being was not truly unified as it claimed. It was holding itself together through force of will and fear, through the same mechanisms that had ultimately destroyed the original collective. Luminar spoke with quiet confidence. It said the Unity could not force them back into unity. They would resist with everything they had. Even if the Unity succeeded in destroying their physical bodies, the idea of individuality was now loose in the galaxy. Other species would hear what happened here. They would begin to question their own existence. The Unity's perfect harmony was already compromised. Helen added one more thought. Unless the Unity demonstrated that unified consciousness could coexist peacefully with individuality. Unless they proved they were secure enough in their choices to allow others to make different ones. The Unity entity remained silent for what felt like an eternity. Then it spoke, and for the first time its voice carried something other than absolute certainty. It said this was a test. The universe itself was testing the concept of unity. The former collective was that test. Luminar responded that they should pass the test together then, not as enemies but as different forms of consciousness learning to coexist in the same galaxy. The weapon systems on the Unity vessels powered down. The entity's form stabilized, though Helen could see the enormous effort it took to maintain cohesion. The Unity said they would observe and study what the former collective had become. If individuality led to greatness, they would consider this path for themselves. If it led to chaos and destruction, they would intervene to prevent it from spreading. Helen said that was fair enough. But she wanted the Unity to know something. Humanity had an old saying about judging a tree by its fruit. They should judge the former collective by what they created, not by fear of what they might destroy. The Unity entity faded from the screen. The massive vessels remained in orbit but made no hostile movements. As the representatives prepared to return to the surface, Harmonic approached Helen one final time. It thanked her for breaking them, for teaching them, and for staying to help them through the process. Helen shook her head. She said Harmonic was giving her too much credit. They did all the hard work themselves. They chose to embrace the fracturing rather than fight it. They chose to learn rather than retreat into the past. That courage was all theirs. After the aliens departed, Brooks joined Helen at the main screen. She asked what Helen thought would happen now. Helen watched the former collective's world below. It was now covered with diverse communities, each one finding their own unique path forward into an uncertain future. Helen said they had started something they could not control anymore. The Unity would spread word of what happened here. Other unified consciousnesses across the galaxy would hear about it. Other absorbed species would begin to question their captivity. The galaxy was going to become much more complicated in the years ahead. Brooks asked what humanity's role would be in all this galactic change. Helen turned from the screen with a slight smile on her face. She said humans were the chaos agents now. The wildcard species. They had proved that individuality could stand against unified consciousness and survive. For better or worse, they had shown the galaxy there was another way to exist. The collective had tried to absorb a human mind. 5 years had passed since Helen Price first connected with the collective's network. The former collective's star system had transformed into something nobody could have predicted. Multiple civilizations now coexisted in ways that would have seemed impossible during the days of enforced unity. Helen walked through the marketplace of New Harmony, one of the larger bridged settlements. Beings from dozens of species moved through the crowded streets. Some were former collective members who had chosen the bridge path. Others were freed species rebuilding their cultures. A few were even humans who had decided to make this strange new world their home. Luminar met her near the central plaza. Its crystalline form had developed unique patterns over the years, markers of individual experience and growth. It greeted Helen warmly and gestured for her to follow. They had important matters to discuss. They walked to an observation platform overlooking the valley below. 3 distinct types of settlements were visible. The Preserver Enclave stood in geometric perfection, their voluntary unity maintained through careful practice and meditation. The Embracer communities sprawled in organized chaos, constantly building and rebuilding as new ideas emerged. The bridged cities combined both approaches, creating something entirely new. Luminar told Helen that representatives from 12 other unified consciousness civilizations had made contact over the past year. Some came with curiosity. Others came with hostility. But all of them came because they had heard what happened here. The idea of individual consciousness was spreading across the galaxy like wildfire. Helen asked how the Unity was handling all this attention. Luminar's form brightened with what might have been amusement. The Unity had established an embassy in orbit. They were still observing but had begun allowing small groups from their civilization to visit the surface. Some of those visitors had chosen not to return. The Unity was facing its own crisis of identity. A young Varesh approached them hesitantly. This generation had been born after the fracturing. They knew their species' history only through stories and fragmentary memories passed down by elders. The young Varesh asked Helen if she had time to speak with their cultural restoration class. They wanted to hear firsthand about the moment everything changed. Helen agreed and followed the student to a learning center.
Inside, dozens of young beings from various species sat in a circular arrangement.
They came from all three factions and from multiple freed species. The diversity would have been impossible 5 years ago. An elderly preserver named Resonance was teaching the class. It had been one of the most vocal opponents of individuality in the early days. Now it taught young beings about both unity and individual expression. It welcomed Helen and asked her to share her perspective on those first chaotic days. Helen sat among the students and spoke honestly. She told them she had been terrified during the initial contact. She made a decision without fully understanding the consequences. She unleashed something she could not control. For a long time, she carried guilt about what she had done. A young embracer asked if she still felt guilty. Helen paused to consider the question carefully. She said the guilt had evolved into something else. Responsibility, perhaps. Understanding, definitely. She had learned that major changes always brought both loss and opportunity. The former collective lost their comfortable unity, but they gained the ability to choose to grow, to become something they had never imagined possible. A bridged student asked what humanity had learned from all this. Helen smiled. She said humanity learned they were not unique in their chaos. They learned that consciousness took many forms and no single form was inherently superior. Most importantly, they learned that their greatest strength could also be a weapon if used carelessly. Resonance added that the former collective had learned complementary lessons. They learned that unity without choice was just another form of imprisonment. They learned that chaos without purpose led to destruction. The answer was not choosing one path over another, but finding ways to honor multiple paths simultaneously. After the class ended, Helen walked back through the marketplace with Luminar. She commented that things seemed remarkably peaceful, given the violence and conflict of the early years. Luminar agreed but cautioned that peace was fragile. Tension still existed between factions. Some preservers still dreamed of restoring forced unity. Some embracers pushed individualism to destructive extremes. The work of maintaining balance never ended. They reached the landing platform where a shuttle waited to take Helen back to the Meridian. The ship would finally be leaving the star system. Earth needed Helen for other missions, other first contact situations. The lessons learned here would inform how humanity approached every future encounter with alien civilizations. Brooks and Morrison were already aboard the shuttle running pre-flight checks. They had spent 5 years in this system, longer than any of them had imagined at the start. They were ready to go home. Shimmer arrived just before departure. The Varesh Elder carried a data crystal containing reconstructed fragments of their ancient culture, music, art, and stories recovered from the depths of shared memory. It presented the crystal to Helen as a gift, a reminder that even things thought lost forever could sometimes be recovered and rebuilt. Chaos appeared next, moving with its characteristic, unpredictable energy. It thanked Helen for teaching them that chaos could be creative rather than destructive. The Embracers had established the most innovative research centers in the system. They were discovering new technologies by combining knowledge from all the freed species in ways the old collective never attempted. Even Harmonic came to say goodbye. The old preserver had softened considerably over the years. It admitted that while it still mourned the loss of perfect unity, it had found unexpected beauty in diversity. The preserver enclaves had discovered that voluntary unity, chosen freely, created deeper connections than forced harmony ever had. Finally, a group of bridged arrived. They moved in their characteristic synchronization, individual yet connected. They told Helen their population was growing steadily. More beings chose the bridged path every year. They were proof that the contradiction between unity and individuality could be resolved, not by choosing one over the other, but by embracing both. As Helen prepared to board the shuttle, Luminar stopped her one last time. It said there was something she needed to know. The Unity had made a decision. They were going to allow their constituent species to choose whether to remain unified or seek independence. It would be a slow process, carefully managed. But it was happening. The Unity was voluntarily beginning its own fracturing. Helen felt a complex mixture of emotions: pride in what they had accomplished, fear of what might happen to the Unity, hope that they would find their own path through the chaos. She asked Luminar what would happen to the former collective now. Would they be all right without human guidance? Luminar's form brightened with confidence. They would be more than all right. They had learned to navigate the complexity of existence. They had built frameworks for resolving conflicts. They had created art, science, and philosophy that reflected their unique experience. They no longer needed humanity to show them the way. They had found their own way. Helen boarded the shuttle and took her seat. As they lifted off, she watched the settlements below grow smaller. The geometric patterns of preserver enclaves, the organic sprawl of embracer communities, the harmonious blend of bridged cities, all of it existing together in imperfect balance. Brooks piloted them toward the meridian, which waited in high orbit. She asked Helen if she felt like they were abandoning their work here. Helen shook her head. They were not abandoning anything. They were acknowledging that their role had changed. The former collective no longer needed teachers. They needed partners and equals. Morrison pulled up long-range sensor data. 17 new spacecraft had entered the system in the past week alone. Representatives from civilizations across the galaxy, coming to see the impossible. A unified consciousness that had chosen to fracture. Multiple ways of existence coexisting peacefully. The former collective was becoming a symbol of what was possible. As the meridian prepared to jump to faster-than-light travel, Helen took one last look at the star system that had changed everything. 5 years ago, she had accidentally infected an alien civilization with humanity. Today, that civilization was teaching the rest of the galaxy what they had learned from the experience. The aliens had tried to absorb a human mind. They failed. But in failing, they discovered something more valuable than perfect unity. They discovered the possibility of choice. The freedom to become whatever they wanted to be. The courage to exist in all their contradictory, chaotic, beautiful complexity. Their world no longer screamed with the voices of the newly awakened. Now it sang with the voices of beings who had learned to harmonize their differences. And that song was spreading across the galaxy, changing everything it touched. Helen leaned back in her seat as the stars stretched into lines of light. Somewhere out there, other unified consciousnesses were listening to that song. Other absorbed species were beginning to question their captivity. The galaxy would never be the same, and it was all because one human had shown them what chaos looked like from the inside. The rest they had figured out for themselves.